Welcome back to Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia, your regular exercise for your own thinking about Australian railways. With your fitness instructor, the Mad Professor, we are down the gym, trying to keep the show on the road as long as life allows, just as we must regularly exercise our bodies through strengthening muscles and developing cardiovascular capacity. Our cities have an analogue, which we see every time we try and move around, without using our bodies for propulsion. We think of cities with arteries, veins, muscles, bones, and a nervous system, which is there to help all of us get around our cities. That, of course, is our transport and communications networks, and it is the same for our long-distance transport networks, but on a grander scale. Yet while just everyone agrees we need personal fitness for long and happy lives, far fewer think that it is important for a city or a country to be fit and healthy, which is odd. There would be few city dwellers, rich or poor, who don't find themselves caught up in bad transport, including rail. And even if you don't use rail yourself, you benefit when others do. Yet many powers within our society have worked to deny us that fitness that comes from having transport systems like rail that do the job we need. As we saw in our previous episode, sometimes it is the political parties who, for whatever reason, have restrained on rail spending. More likely, it is our different bureaucracies. Most infamously the treasuries, but others as well, such as Prime Minister or Premier's departments, transport and rail bureaucracies themselves, or it could be those urban planning ministries and local governments, whose handiwork we saw in our recent episode with friends like these, undermining rail to achieve their own bespoke urban planning dreams. And stretching our metaphor a little bit too far, maybe we can think of the policy process in Australia, which we called muddling through in our 4th episode, demonstration of a lack of collective mental fitness. People who haven't done their metaphorical Sudoku, or whatever the equivalent would be, to have a form of fitness in policy making. The policy process becomes sclerotic, and those neural networks within government don't function like they should. And to take the metaphor further than we should, maybe the muddling through is a form of institutional laziness, a political system that won't go to the gym. And in our episode 16, we discussed how urban planners are always pushing the idea that good transport is somehow dependent on good urban planning, which is rubbish. No matter where we find ourselves, the rail or transport planner must do the best job they can with the city they have, not buying into those urban planning fantasies, except where they might be able to make a real difference. They could be on the very edge of cities, having rail networks in place before the urban planners arrive. Those bureaucrats did a lot of damage. To reverse this damage has required great political courage, mostly from politicians. And something happened after the great financial crisis of 2008. Not immediately, mind you, maybe 2 years or so later. But with the Federal Reserve money tap running freely, government stopped panicking and got on with what they needed to do. If you remember our episode 10, Money, 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 you'll understand. It is not about the furphy called debt, but the reality that governments can print money out to infinity, only limited by the real economy, which is something we will discuss in this episode. We are in the middle of a giant construction boom in rail transport in Australia that has been running for about 15 years, but may soon be coming to a pause. So in today's episode we will look at the myth that Australia doesn't spend money on rail projects, a long list of these rail projects, whether we really got what we wanted from these projects, and if not, why not? And finally, ask the question, what is the real limit on our ability to do rail projects if it isn't the money? Tabulating all of Australia's rail projects is an art and a science. Your Mad Professor dates the current cycle as after the 2008 financial crisis, but you could possibly start it earlier. The date we've chosen here in 2011 means not counting projects like the Mandurah line, Epping to Chatswood line, the Alice to Darwin line, or the last extension of the Gold Coast line. But they were financed in a different time, with different costs and different interest rates. And most of the ones we are interested in make a clear start from 2011. They may have been planned before that, but their real money outlay only started at that time. The dossier of these projects is linked to in the links below. There are 112 projects in it. But before we do that, it's worth acknowledging how much guesswork is involved. The dossier shows actual published costs. as well as some estimates, which in turn are established, if possible, from two reference projects, Balhinia electrification and the Kippering line. Old project prices need to be adjusted for inflation if they were delivered more than a couple of years ago. Future projects are shown with the best known cost published for today. We won't know what they will cost until they're eventually done. The status of each project is shown. Delivered and underway status are pretty obvious, but we also have projects that have the status of planned, and projects shown as having legs, by which we mean the project has been proposed officially and has some standing, not necessarily as well as those that are actually planned, but not nothing either. And a few captain's picks are in there. Let's put a number on their value. They total $660 billion. Think about that. The best part of $1 trillion. We have definitely avoided just spitballing or drawing lines on maps. We all do it, and it can be fun. But the projects in the dossier are all very real. The total value of all the projects that have actually been delivered is $86 billion. How does this number compare with the United States of America? Amtrak Joe has put $80 billion into rail in his latest package, a jurisdiction 20 times the size of Australia. Of course, US state and local governments also spend on rail, but still at this level our spending stands up well. Moving through to our spending underway, all that construction we see around us, that comes in at $152 billion. And the biggest number, those things still in the pipeline, but where serious work has happened, or is happening, to bring them to reality, that comes in at $379 billion. And finally, a mix of projects we describe as having legs. Maybe we could also term them serious proposals, as they are a mixture of past proposals that never got up, but should have, or things that have been talked about for a while, and we can still find 41 billion of those projects. And that's without having to dream up any new ones, or some of our fossilised projects we talked about in our episode 9 Electric Dreams. You may remember Joe Bioki-Peterson talking about electric trains to Townsville, or Whitlam's line from Canberra to Yass. So overall, a fairly robust and very large number. So why the myth that Australia doesn't spend on rail projects? Two good reasons. The first, as we saw in our episode 8, Who Blamed Roger Rabbit? There has been a pervasive lie that the road lobby killed off rail transport in this country. And we can't maintain a victim narrative with so much actual and planned spending. But the second is that over a much longer time horizon, going back to the end of the 1920s, that probably was the case. We had a few headline nation-building projects like the Transcontinental Line in 1970, or the Melbourne to Wodonga Standard Gauge Line, and a few headline urban projects like the Eastern Suburbs Railway or the City Loop. But very little else. Generations of advocates and enthusiasts have been telling themselves how dry the landscape is, while the floodwaters of railway spending are lapping at their feet. But they are also right to notice how the media have been treating rail spending. Despite some enthusiasm for projects case by case, generally both the Murdoch and Costello media are anti-rail, for slightly different reasons. And if you drink this media Kool-Aid, you might believe their spin. They think their posturing changes the minds of governments and wins elections, but it doesn't. We will do a quick tour of the states and pick out the notable ones. First and foremost is the Melbourne to Brisbane high-speed rail. We went over that in our episode 12, It's High Time. If we believed AECOM, who wrote the report, we might as well believe in Santa Claus. Nonetheless, according to AECOM, we could have spent $100 billion on what they thought was a good idea. A far cry from the single billions the VFT and speed rail before them were slated to cost. Of course, as we tally these projects that didn't happen, we need to adjust the list for those that have either been superseded by later projects or overlap with similar projects. For example, if we had built the VFT, we wouldn't need speed rail at all, and we would only need half of AECOM. In a similar nation-building vein, the Inland Rail project does have some potential city impacts, getting trucks off roads, and upgrading some lines near cities for better performance, such as Toowoomba to Brisbane. In New South Wales we have the Sydney Metro schemes, from northwest to southwest, from City to Parramatta, and from St Mary's in Durrett Country to the new airport for starters. We've also had in the last 10 years the Dulwich Hill and Randwick light rail schemes through Gadigal lands, plus the Moolabinba, otherwise called Newcastle, and Parramatta light rail schemes. And the Parramatta scheme looks set to be extended inwards towards Homebush. Right back at the start of our time window, we saw the line to Leppington complete, as well as some track augmentation around the place. Moving on to Melbourne, the signature project right now is the Melbourne Metro Tunnel, from South Yarra to South Kensington. It's 5 new underground stations. We have work started on the suburban rail loop, from Box Hill to Cheltenham, on Wurundjeri and Bunurong land, and controversially, announcements not yet fulfilled for a line from Albion to the airport. Some tests have been done, but this line really has ground to a halt. Separately, we've had the giant level crossing removal project, with nearly 100 level crossings and station rebuilds in place or underway. At the start of our time window, we had the line from Deer Park West to Manor Loop via Tarneet built. Not one of our finest hours to be sure, but it does provide a service to Tarneet and Wyndham Vale on the suburban fringe. And with this, an effective sextuplication of the line from the city to Sunshine also took place. And like in Sydney, some track augmentation, this time to Cranbourne. And unlike in Sydney, some kindness in terms of rail lines being rebuilt around the state for passenger trains. The costs have been huge, and the results very underwhelming. But we can see some benefit for Shepparton, Echuca, Warrnambool, Ballarat, Traralgon, all at a minimum. And separately, the ARTC has been slowly rebuilding parts of the Melbourne to Albury line. Back in New South Wales, we have seen some interesting but not particularly beneficial work by ARTC to Moree and North Star, which will surely help, but may not yet be worth what they are spending on it. Moving north, Meanjin Brisbane has a similar project to Melbourne with a new underground route through the city called Cross River Rail. New lines have been opened in the last 15 years to Kippa on Gabby Gabby land and Springfield on Yungara country. Some work is now committed for a straightening of the Nambour route, an extra track on the Gold Coast Railway, and the Gold Coast has opened a light rail scheme which is being extended. And a glimmer of spending has emerged for routes from Ipswich to Ripley, extending the Gold Coast Railway, and a few other bibs and bobs. On the topic of light rail, let's not forget Canberra and its Gungahlin line now being extended. Pickings have been slim in South Australia, but within the last 15 years, the Tonsley line has been improved and slightly extended. The Gawler line has been finally electrified, and some track work for trams in the city improved. WA is probably the shining star, with Metronet and related projects. On top of the work done in the last 15 years to extend the Joondalup line to Butler, the system has been significantly expanded to the airport, with a new underground line opening last year. And projects to extend to Ellenbrook, Byford, Coburn from Thornley and Yanchep are all much closer to completion than not. Much of this has been through the personal motivation and political capital of Labor leader Mark McGowan, though the Libs have done a few things too. Sadly, there is little based in Tasmania, so we've thrown in the Hobart Light Rail proposal. The Tasrail system has been upgraded for freight, which is a lot of work, but it didn't help the cities of the island. If you want to learn more about Tasrail, see our 15th episode, Treasure Island. We have put in the rolling stock orders and disability compliance, though these might have happened anyway on a needs basis. Both represent a maintenance of the status quo, but also an improvement as standards improve. Stretching off to the never never, we have some projects on our list that may have had some planning done, and just need a little more political will. Both New South Wales and Victoria have also made noises about high-speed rail within their borders, to parks of all places, to Geelong, the Illawarra and others. What this really means is hard to say. But taking them at their word, these improvements are potentially on top of what might have happened with VFT or ACOM. Both Sydney and Melbourne have other as yet unfunded underground railway projects. In Sydney, we have an extension of the Parramatta Metro to Zetland, the South West Metro to Liverpool, the Bringelly Airport line to Oran Park, the Tallawong Metro onto Marsden Park and St Mary's. None have any real commitment, though land has probably been purchased for many of them. In Melbourne, the follow-up projects to the Melbourne Metro Tunnel are supposed to be one from Clifton Hill or thereabouts to Newport through the city, extensions to the Box Hill to Cheltenham suburban rail loop, and removing the city loop in favour of a direct line via the current underground from Richmond to North Melbourne. A lot of work there. And that's just the so-called heavy rail. A new category of light rail also had such trains going via Chadstone and onto Rowville. Other tram extensions, from simple ones in Park Street, South Melbourne, to much more substantial ones. Adelaide in Corner Country is a sorry case. Some light rail work has been proposed in the Port Adelaide area, and also a return of heavy rail to the Port Dock, and finally, extending the Seaford line further south. But all of this remains to be seen. Perth in the Noongar lands of Western Australia looks like reaching the end of a substantial burst of work. There are more unfinished plans. We talked about the possibility of a major new line to Bunbury in our episode Back on Track. But there is also the need for a line to Mirrabooka or East Wanneroo, and popular pressure for more of the freight ring route to be electrified, possibly from Fremantle. Unlike those other jurisdictions that muddle through, we can be sure the WA schemes would be well advanced in terms of planning, just waiting for funding, possibly after the current Metronet completion. And maybe some eclectic ones, extending the Gold Coast Light Rail across the border to Tweed Heads in Bundjalung land, rearrangement of the freight service through Newcastle via Minmai may free up the passenger line a bit. We'll have to wait and see how all this planning and proposing goes. If our enthusiast and advocate base are never happy with 660 billion, or even the 238 billion either delivered or underway, it may be because the results are less than impressive. Your mad professor has to resist the urge to come up with a vastly better proposal to spend all that sort of money. But it stands to reason. If we had no railways already, but we did have 660 billion lying around, would we build the railways we have, or something better than them? You know the answer to this rhetorical question. Our cities would have fully underground or maybe elevated railways on major trunk routes. Since 1970, fully automated railways have been perfectly feasible. So that is what you should have always been aiming for in the densely settled urban cores. Something akin to a rail system that is half Sydney Metro and half Perth Metronet. On the intercity routes, you could have a solid network of both high-speed electric passenger trains and double-stack capable freight lines, and you would still have change from your 660 billion. So the answer to our rhetorical question is that the bureaucracy have spent or plan to spend far more than necessary because they want to sustain a 180-year-old rail system as close as possible to how it was built. And then on the margins of their spending plan, they will cry poor because even more is needed. That's on the assumption they have any bona fide intention to finish the plans. The other question is, what do we do now the US Federal Reserve money printer appears to have run out of ink? Historians decades from now will definitely attribute the rush of spending in the 2010s and 2020s to the quantitative easing, making it possible for governments as well as individuals to gear up. Only the 2020s inflation has caught up with all this spending and is making governments panic. The Victorian government has deferred the airport line, or changes of government in New South Wales and federally prompted so-called reviews. The underway projects will still take a few years to roll out completely, maybe to the mid or even late 2020s. And after that is anyone's guess. It is hard to see any government, federal or state, rushing to take on new and very large projects, which is a pity for such projects as the Melbourne Airport line, Sunshine Coast Heavy and Light Rail, Sydney to Newcastle high-speed rail, and many others are no less urgent now than they have been for decades. And as we said, money is not the real barrier, it is productivity. We are building the skills onshore and in-house to deliver all these works. And Andrews did the right thing establishing the Victorian Tunnelling Centre. If we can have hundreds of people, especially young trainees or apprentices, who have worked on underground railway construction, we can definitely build more of these lines with less cost, less dependence on flying people in from overseas. But that is just one niche of the skills issue. Having more capital onshore is also important. Australia has done well for nearly 50 years in creating pools of retirement income and sovereign wealth, and is one of the largest centres of funds management. But every time someone needs financing or funding for transport projects, we either get government borrowing or shady schemes with acronyms like BOOT or PPP. We just need to go back to a simple bond issuing process, bonds that can be bought retail or wholesale, and are transparently linked to the asset being acquired. And finally, the Liberals, may they burn in hell, did have some good ideas with the notion of asset recycling. In a future episode, we'll cover the pros and cons of public and private ownership of rail assets. But for today, we will say in short that it can be a good idea to take a public asset that is mature and has a stable expenditure and revenue stream, and sell it so that the money raised can be used to build a new one and put as much certainty into the system as possible. So if we can get the skills and capital onshore, we can finish that list and then build the rail networks we need. Next time on Radically Rethinking Railways. Railways need their monsters for scaring young children and closing branch lines. In Britain they had their man. But what about here? Who did we have to scare us? What if these ghouls and goblins don't exist? In Dr. Beeching, I presume. See you then.